Good morning. Here we are again, session 12, summer of 2020. Today we're going to be looking in the Song of Solomon this week and next week before we begin our study in Isaiah. But we're going to be talking about relational foundations, what we need for our relationships, the foundations we need to set. Ann Ortlund was an author and radio broadcaster with her husband, Roy Ortlund. She said this: "We have to work hard at marriage. It's the most fun work in the world, but it's still work." Our relationships need work, and that's what this is all about. And this is what we're going to look at Solomon's showing us, teaching us here in this section. God is speaking through him about our relationships. Sometimes when you talk to children, you learn the strangest things and how they view us in a relationship by asking them questions. And these are a series of questions asked to boys and girls who roughly are in between the ages of 7 and 11. And this one question they asked: "How do you decide whom to marry?" And a young boy said, "You find someone who likes the same stuff you like. If you like sports, she should like it. And keep the chips and dips coming." That's a young boy at the age of 11. A young girl said this: "No person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it way before, and you got to find out who you're stuck with." Well, sometimes this is how kids view us when we ask these questions. It's interesting. An 8-year-old girl, when asked this, she said, "Why do people go out on a date?" And she said, "Dates are for having fun, and people should go on them to get to know each other. Even boys have something to say if you listen long enough." And then a 7-year-old boy who appeared to be wise beyond his years, he responded to this: "How do you make marriage work?" And he said, "Tell your wife she looks pretty even if she doesn't." So you see, when asked how a stranger can tell if two people were married, a young boy replied, "You might have to guess based on whether they seem to be yelling at the same kids." Well, there's just some of the things. That's how they see things. And sometimes we can take that insight and say, hey, do I really come across that way? And kind of look at that and maybe improving our relationships. Well, we don't have to rely on children to know how to relate to each other as husband and wives, but God, through Solomon, gives us some clues on how our romantic relationships with each other should be through his romantic relationship with a Shulamite woman. So we see that, how relationships work. And we can even apply some of these just to our relationships with our friends as well. And so let's kind of look and see what Solomon has to say to us. First of all, in Song of Solomon is a book. It serves as a chronicle of Solomon's romantic relationship with the Shulamite woman. And you ask, well, who is this woman? Well, quite frankly, it just says in chapter 6, verse 13, she's a Shulamite woman, and her exact identity is not known. There's speculation, but it's not really known. And so we just know this is about his relationship with her. This section shows us how their relationship right before and after their wedding. So if you read through this section, read section chapter 1 through chapter 5, verse 1, and to see how this plays out. We learn a few things about her. And in chapter 1, verse 6, about the Shulamite woman, we know that she says in verse 1:6, "Do not stare at me because I am dark, for the sun has glazed on me. My mother's sons were angry with me, and they made me take care of the vineyards. I have not taken care of my own vineyard." And we see there in that particular section that she's probably well tanned from the sun, from having to work outside in the fields, and got a deeper tan than most everyone else because of that. Her mother's sons, made her work in the vineyard, and she wasn't able to take care of her own vineyard. What she's implying there, she wasn't able to take care of herself, and she was busy working in the vineyard. But notice how Solomon sees her down in verse 8, as he says this down in verse 8. "If you do not know, most beautiful of women." He's responding to her that way. "If you do not know, most beautiful women, follow the tracks of the flock and to pasture young goats near the shepherd's tent to find him." The idea, see the lofty position he places her in? If you do not know, most beautiful of women. And so he's placing her in that category. So today we're going to see some guidelines for relationships no matter what our age is. And we're going to take it, we can apply them to our life. So the first thing we want to look at is in verse 15 of chapter 2. We're going to look at this idea of what it means for preventative care in our relationships. And Solomon's love poem tells a story about his romantic relationship with the woman who would become his wife. All right, so like other poems, it's written in a rich blend of literal and figurative language, which can be hard to understand at times, trying to figure out what in the world are they saying. You have to kind of stop and slow down and really read through it and think through it. Well, the setting of this verse 15, where we start, takes place in the springtime, and he's inviting the woman out to walk in the vineyards. He says, the woman says, catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, for our vineyards are in bloom. And we know this where they're out walking, because you go back up into verses 10 through 13 in chapter 2, and you see this sign, what it says here. My love calls to me, and the man says, arise, my daughter, come away, my beautiful one, for now the winter is past. So we see that it's springtime that they're talking about. The rains have ended and gone away, and the blossoms appear in the countryside. So it's spring. The spring rains have come, and the flowers are blossoming. Time to sing has come. The turtle dove's cooing is heard in our land, and the fig tree ripens its figs. The blossoming of the vines give off the fragrance. Arise, my daughter, come away, my beautiful one. So he wants her to go for a stroll with him in the garden. And you see that he talks about the vines and the vineyard and stuff like that. So they're talking about this idea of going out for a walk with him. And so he's asking her to come out. So we notice that as the first thing. As they walk along, one of them brought up the subject. Now, this particular section, it says, the man speaking, arise, my daughter, in verse 11 to come out. And then they think that the woman starts speaking in this section. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that ruin our vineyard, for our vineyards are in bloom. So one of them, as they're walking along, and the CSB thinks it's the woman who brings this up, all right, about catching the foxes that would invade a vineyard. They begin to talk about things in their marriage. That is what is pictured here. The things in their marriage or their upcoming marriage that would invade the vineyard, that would invade their marriage and cause havoc. So what is the danger of foxes in the vineyard? And that's what you look at, that idea, understanding what the danger is, foxes in the vineyard. Small animals like foxes could sneak into a vineyard without anyone seeing them. Because they're small, they can sneak in, they wouldn't know. Foxes have adapted to living and even in urban areas. And so they can sneak in. And this is the reason the farmer guards his vineyards, and they even would build walls around their vineyards to try to keep the small animals out from coming in, including the foxes. And apparently some ancient sources state that foxes had a fondness for grapes. They would like to go in and eat the grapes and so forth, and eat the vines. And if you had small pigs come in, they would eat and root up and tear up the vines. And so the idea was to keep these small animals and the foxes out of the vineyard. Once they invaded the vineyard, well, they would chew up the vines and the roots and just really wreak havoc. And this could happen before they even were aware of it, before anyone even knew. So what do the foxes represent when it comes to our relationship in our marriages and with our friends as well? Well, the old proverb of an ounce of prevention is worth what? It's certainly worth a pound of cure. That's the idea. Here the little foxes represent the small things, if left unattended, can become big problems in a marriage, in a relationship of any kind. The idea here, the word catch, is an imperative. It's not, that's what he's saying, catch. It's kind of, it comes as a command from the Lord. Catch these things. And the idea is to catch them before they can cause damage. And so we see here, catch them early. We're out here and there's no damage. Catch them before they can come in and cause the damage. And so what are the two things we can draw from this verse as we look at it? Well, the first thing is, trouble in our relationships usually come in small things. It's where it starts, because they can grow unseen. Why is this? Because we have a tendency to ignore small things. We just, okay, that's not a big thing. But then we start stacking small thing on top of small thing on top of small thing, and it becomes a bigger problem. So the tendency is for these things to grow if we don't deal with them. And we have to be careful. And so we start putting them one on top of another. And so what we want to do is, the idea is here to catch them before they start to grow. And that's the idea that she's stating here. Catch the foxes before they can cause the damage. Remember, the other thing we want to remember is that relationships are uniquely sensitive things. What might be some of the things that left unattended become a problem, especially between a husband and wife? Well, maybe just a few of these things, if they're not talked about. One, where will we attend church and how will we be involved? Have we discussed this? Do we even know if we're on the same page here? A lot of times we seem to go through life without discussing things with our spouse, and we don't even know if we're on the same page. And so that idea, are we willing to be flexible in our relationship? Is there give and take? Is there areas where there can't be give and take? And for us to talk about those things and understand our relationship with each other. Are you comfortable sharing your feelings and your desires and your goals with each other? Do we discuss that so that one individual doesn't think one thing and the other thinks another? If they haven't shared their goals, then they need to work together. Here's one that we can all are guilty of. Have we committed not to criticize each other in public? That can be a devastating thing. And are we personally committed to making sure our marriage is a success, whatever the cost or sacrifice? Or are we personally committed to make sure our relationships with our friends are what? A success, no matter what the cost or sacrifice. And do they know it? In other words, have we talked this over with our spouse? Do they know that? This is part of the preventative care that helps keep relationships going. Do our friends know that we care about them and will sacrifice and do what we need to keep our friendship going? That's the idea that we're looking at. So we see that first thing is preventative care, and he's focusing primarily on the relationship between a spouse and husband here, a husband and a wife. And so we're looking at that idea. Preventative care is important in that relationship. Well, the next thing we want to look at is in Psalms 2:16-17, is we need to build trust. And as we see that, as we read those verses, my love is mine and I am his. My feelings, he feeds among the lilies until the day breaks and the shadows flee. Turn around, my love, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the divided mountains. And so here we come, this idea. What do these verses affirm here? What are they talking about? And when you think about it, it is a kind of, they're affirming trust, aren't they? They affirm trust. There's love. They love for one another. This is what it affirms. It's their love for one another. And then you ask, what is love built upon? And it's built upon trust. And so then you ask yourself, do each of you know this? Our love is built upon that trust that we have in one another. Their trust of each other. And what is that trust built upon in their relationship? Yeah, well, that's what it is. It's trust. The woman here is stating that, beloved, that they belong to each other exclusively. That's what that trust is. They belong to each other exclusively in a relationship that allows no intrusions. Now, do each of us know that in our relationship, that it has no intrusions? They are building trust by dedicating themselves to one another. That's what it says, my love is mine and I am his. He feeds among the lilies. And so they're building that, dedicating themselves to one another in building that trust. So how does this build out in our relations outside of marriage? It applies in marriage. You build trust by not doing things. Remember the things we talked about earlier in that preventative care, by not doing those things that harm trust, not doing those things that hurt our partner. We do the same thing in our relationships with our friends and others. We basically want to make sure that we don't do things that will harm our friends and cause for us to violate their trust and their confidence in us if we want them to stay our friends. And so we do that idea there is to maintain those relationships, no matter whether that's a husband or wife or friends. They need that kind of preventative care to make sure that we're treating them. I mean, the Apostle Paul told us to consider others as more important than yourself. And that's the idea here when we look at this idea. Well, as we looked on this idea that he feeds, or in some verses uses grazes, stresses the groom's fidelity to the bride. And this is what it's doing. It's stressing that fidelity to the bride. She first describes herself as a lily back in chapter 2, verse 1. If you look back at that chapter, it says, Like a lily among thorns, so is my darling among the young women. And so that's what she's first described that way, all right, as that lily. And as she's coming back, he comes and feeds among the lilies. And so he is mine and I am his. We're devoted to one another, all right. I'm like a wildfire of flowers of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. And his response is like the lily among the thorns, so my darling among the young women. Notice that response there. Like a lily among the thorns, so is my darling among the young women. And what is he saying when he says that? He's saying to her, no, none of the other women compare to you. That's what he's saying to her. When we see that idea, none of the other women compare to her. And so what a beautiful picture this is. Like the lily among the thorns, so is my darling among the young women. So here we have that beautiful picture here of the idea of they belong to one another. He, being the king, would routinely be around beautiful women. That would happen, part of his court. Yet she's not jealous, but eagerly awaits till they can be together. And that's the idea that she's giving here. She's eagerly awaiting until they can be together. And what a beautiful picture this is. All right, the picture here falls also at the end of the day, just before sunset. Notice what it says, until the day breaks and the shadows flee. And what we have here is that idea, the shadows are fleeing, the day's breaking, the sunlight's going, the sun is setting. And that's the picture when this happens, the shadows flee. And she's calling out to him. And what is this she's calling? When she calls out, and what is she saying when she says, or a picture of, when she says calling out to him as a young stag? What is that a picture of it she's giving here? And she's giving the idea that he's young and full of life and virile, and she's calling out to him to come to her. Now, the imagery in this verse suggests intimacy, very, very much so. And she couldn't look forward until they could come together and become husband and wife, to spend the night together. She's like inviting him to come. And so she can't wait until that night when they can get together to their marriage night and they can spend the night together. Now, some Bible scholars believe the divided mountains may be a reference to actual mountain ranges in Israel, and that's possible. However, the nature of the content is more likely is it a figurative way to refer to the enticing physical features of the woman, her shapeliness that attracts men. And so this is what she's calling him to come to her and to be with her. Her words paint a picture that she wants to be in his presence. Right? This is physical intimacy that is normal between a husband and wife. It's a natural component of romantic love. And that's what the picture we see here. But she has already stated back that that kind of intimacy is to be held until the wedding night. And she's mentioned that earlier in chapter 2, verse 7, when she's talking to the daughters of Jerusalem. And she mentions this to them. Young women of Jerusalem, I charge you, by the gazelles and by the wild does of the field, do not stir up or awaken love until the appropriate time. And she's pointing out that appropriate time is not until you're married. And so she's pointing that out. And so we see that. So not only is our relational foundations require preventative care, they need to be built on trust, and they need to wait until the appropriate time that God has ordained after marriage. And we see that. Then we see the next section, restraint is required on both parties. And this section is a picture of her having a nightmare, possibly the night before they are married. And she has a nightmare, and it says there, in my bed at night, I sought the one I love. I sought him, but did not find him. And she's having a nightmare. Where is my husband? Where is he gone? Where is he? And she can't find him. She wakens to find him gone, and nowhere to be found. So in response to the groom's absence, in her dream, she leaves her bedroom to look for him, all right? That's her first thought in the dream. Leave her bedroom, go search for him. So this is what it's causing. This is a nightmare, actually, causing intense feeling. Because that's what we see in the verb rendered will, seek, and sought. Gives the idea of the individual intense search for something or someone. It's a very intense search. Now, this would not be a wise thing to do, to go out at night like this, especially for a young woman. Yet in her anxiety and her dream, she goes out. Why would this be unsafe when we think about it? Well, unlike Bradenton and other major cities all over America, there were no street lights. the only lights they had after dark would have been coming from inside of homes where people had candles and stuff lit. And if it's late enough at night, those would be out and everyone would be sleeping, so it would be totally dark outside. There aren't street lights out there. Everything would be totally dark, especially the alleyways. If you look down an alleyway, even the moonlight might not be shining down in there. And so that would be very dark. She wanted to go out, and one of the things, it was a strong desire on her part. She needed to answer, why was he missing? And that was part of her nightmare. In ancient Israel cities, they had night watchmen, and then we see that as we read on. I sought in my bed at night. I sought the one I love. I sought him, but I did not find him. And I will arise and go out about the city, through the streets, the plazas. I will seek the one I love. That passion's coming out of her for him. You see that? And the guards who go about the city found me. I asked them, have you seen the one I love? And here we see Israelite cities would have night watchmen. What was the purpose of having night watchmen? They had two primary purposes. One, they were to walk around inside and up on the walls and the gates and so forth. They were to warn people about attack from outside. There to be a warning. They see trouble coming and they warn people from outside. And they also had another purpose inside. They would actually guard inside as well, watching for things like dangers like fire and crime and stuff like that. And so they had that job as well. And so what are these watchmen a picture of? And if you look at this, they are virtues that guard her purity. The things that are guarding her purity. That's what those watchmen look like. Who did Proverbs picture roaming around the city? Remember, we studied in Proverbs before we got to and who was it roaming around the city? Well, a woman pictured as wisdom was roaming around seeking those. And also there was a woman of evil, a prostitute running around seeking who she could deceive. And so we see that picture there. She's out trying to find him, to protect him. That is her going out of her way to try to guard him and to protect him and to bring him back safely. And once again, she displays her intense love by asking, have you seen him, to the guards? And right after she goes by him in verse 4, right then, I had just passed them when I found the one I love. I held on to him and would not let him go until I brought him to my mother's house, the chamber of the one who conceived me. And so we see this picture here. She holds on to him. So what is verse 4 saying to us? In her desperation, she goes out, looks for him, and she clings to him. She clings to him, and it points to her passion for him. All right, and her passion for her future husband. She does not want to lose him again. She doesn't want him to be wandering. And what does the idea of her mother's house represent here? She's bringing him back to a secure place, a safe place, a place of security for her. So she brings him back. And then we finally finish up with verse 5, in verse 5, which is something we need to do. It's a warning in the Song of Solomon that we see throughout this entire song. And we see it's a warning given to us. Young women of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the wild does of the field, do not stir up or awaken love until the appropriate time. Again, she states that verse. What is she telling us? She's charging young women in Jerusalem, and this applies to both young women and men, right? She's warning those young women, don't become sexually active until before marriage, because that would deprive you of them enjoying God's design fully. When that happens, when it takes away from the marriage, and so one needs to realize that. We want to make sure that we keep things pure the way God does. I mean, if you look through the history of all the problems that are caused through unfaithfulness, if people will remain faithful, a lot of these troubles would go away. And it's important for us to think along those lines. So she's warning them, right? Rather than what the culture says. The culture says this idea of free love, and that happened back in the 60s and early 70s, the idea of free love. But if we follow God's ways, these are safeguards that protect us and protect our relationships so that we can have healthy relationships with our spouse. And we can apply some of these same principles into our relationship with our friends as well. So here's the idea. What are our relationship foundations between a husband and wife? Let's stick to what God's plan is, and we will be happy. Happiness is found. People are statistically more happy in marriage, being devoted to one another, than people who are single or people who are just cohabitating, living together. Let's follow God's plan and find happiness. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for showing us the Word of God and what this means. Help us to understand the relationships we need to have. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.